definition of a country doctor. For brevity, he is a man that wears a vest, and in the left-hand pocket he has a couple of thermometers, a fountain pen. In his left-hand coat pocket he has a stethoscope. On his heels of his shoes he has a little horse manure and a case to discuss. Since I've been invited to come here and speak a little on the historical past of medicine, both locally, by that I mean state, and nationally, by that I mean encompassing the pros and cons, of which you older men know something about, and pray God you younger men will be spared. I'll try and start with, let us say, the genesis of why you're here. Your good director has done some very excellent and able writing in the presentation of the miner, who he is, what he is, and why he is. But he started in the middle of the Old Testament. I'll try and start for a moment at Genesis. If I'm wrong, any of you Bible students correct me later. Oddly enough, the state of West Virginia, probably like no other state in the Union, became habitable outside of the Conestoga wagon and others going through it, and still do from the looks of the census, was a state where towns developed at railheads. It was a state of heavy industry, primarily coal and lumber. That meant you had to move it by rail. So that when a location was found that was economically worth developing, a railhead was put in, a town was established, and then the inhabitants were brought in. Who were the inhabitants? The inhabitants were primarily from the Mediterranean portion of Europe and Asia. They were brought over in steerage to come to the great new country where the lady held up her high torch for a new thinking, to get out not of slavery in the true sense of the word, the African sense, but peonage in the dictator sense, as those countries were formed. That being the case, historically we brought in labor that came from the family unit, and his great endeavor in landing in the country of gold streets was to make enough to bring his family and feel free, to be able to do what he called freedom, not knowing what freedom was. Not sure we do now. So that when he went into the mines or the lumber camps, he went in to an isolated region. His only method of contact with the outside world was the occasional newspaper the telegraph instrument, and the men who rode the rails. He was tied down. He went to work depending on his job at any hour of the day or night. He earned money. That's something he had not seen in the old country. This money was real money. It's backed by the United States government, that great country, that new world. And he would have some of it. Unfortunately, other factors were playing a part. He got 8 cents a ton for his coal. I think that's what was paid when I worked in the mines in 1913. Don't misunderstand me. I was playing ball on the side. I didn't work very hard. My biggest problem was to go out and find carloads of post holes. He was earning this money. Of course, he didn't get paid for the rock. He only got paid for the coal. And he got paid every 2 weeks. And he would go to the company office to collect his pay. And at the company office, he would be given a group of slips called chits, because these were money. These were what he bought food with. He would come to the office between paydays and ask for a couple of dollars to go to the company store and purchase his food. And he would be given a chit. He was always careful that he always owed the company about 50 or 75 cents each payday. He rarely saw the color of this United States money. He was always in debt. If he got ahead a little bit, there was one of his comrades who had come over a little bit smarter, and he was the man who knew how to make out the money orders to send money back to the family. And he did this. He was a great friend. All he asked was anywhere from 10 to 30% for making out the money order to send back to the family. We can't call this slavery. We'll call it isolationism, for a better word. Those of you who are interested in historical facts will go back to about 1923 or 24, when H.L. Mencken wrote a most astonishing and illuminating article on the company store. Many times the coal was not the profit. The company store was, because that's the only place he could buy. And no competition could come in, because the chit would not be recognized by a private store. So he had to go to the company store. So that what is a miner, and why is he isolated, and why does he live a peculiar life as written by this young man? I think is better explained by the etiology of his being a miner, as it was in being a transcontinental railroad worker, except that when the railroad was through, he drifted into a town and became a human being and a person, sometimes a politician, sometimes a businessman. He grew. This was not permitted of the miner. He was always subjugated to the whim and will of the job which was created by an act of God, and the minerals that were taken out for the profit of the non-resident people. In the late teens and early 20s, the Union came along. The Union, like any other new process of democracy, of life, was a sprawling centipede with many feet and not really knowing where it was going, and created within itself problems that unfortunately added to the problem of the miner, innocently on his part. Just shortly before I came, there were machine guns on the hillside, and I remember having been maybe here a month, 2 months, when the superintendent of the mines brought in a man. He said, "I want your help, Ben." And I said, "What do you want me to do?" He said, "I want you to put a bandage around his head and put a little red ink on it. I want to show that he was hit in a fight." Innocently, I did what he asked to do. I didn't help any situation except to make it worse. These were things that brought about the camps, and I use the word camps or mine towns, if you will, because the town was built by the owner of the mine, rented to the miner. He paid $2 a month for his electricity, which was turned off at 10 o'clock at night. He could leave it on all day, and he did, because it was too much trouble to turn off. He still paid $2 a month. That was modern. He had electricity. That didn't bother the company any, because they had a surplus of power. This didn't cost them anything, really. And they rented the house, which was unbelievable. I don't know whether any of them are really standing today that haven't had some support given to them, a couple of crutches or something to keep them up. But they lived fairly well. And when I was in Italy and some of the other southern countries and saw some of these little towns where these people came from and tried to visualize 50, 75 years back, I guess they were living well, comparatively speaking. But at all times, they were under the yoke. They were never themselves. I remember 1914, sitting up in the office on a payday, when a big Polish man came in for his money. I guess he was 6'6". Later, to me, he became 12 feet. Between me and the aisle he could walk through the collect was a steel grating, which we were told below the counter level was lead, and there were 2 pistols under there, just for safety. And I told him he had no money coming. We were just on the edge then of World War I. The aisle was probably a little wider than this table. He stepped back against the wall and he made one leap and came to the top of that iron grating, which was about 12 feet, white, trembling, grabbed it, and I felt the grating was going to come down. And he came down, war coming, lots of people killed. By God, maybe we get a penny. This is to illustrate the mentality which was not on the surface, but which was brewing underneath and made unionism possible. But unfortunately, as in everything else, something good always has something corrupt. And then we had inter-union company, company union, etc. So I've tried to bring you up to date as to why the miner thought he was isolated. He was. Why he thought he was of a different breed than the people in town. He never saw people in town. He had no way to get to town, with rare exceptions. In 1918, I think, President Wilson sent Alonzo Taylor, professor of pharmacology at the University of Pennsylvania, up to Shamokin and some of the anthracite areas to see whether or not he could report back a method, suggestion, to which the government might establish a setup, and I use that for the want of a better word, a bureau it'll be today, to teach the miner that he was earning good money now and to try and save some of it. I knew Dr. Taylor. His report to President Wilson was, you can't do that. These people are starving, not in the sense of food, but in the sense of life. And if they have an extra dollar, the first thing they want is a big red lamp in their parlor. It makes them feel that they're prosperous. And then after they get the red lamp, they want to buy a piano, even though nobody can play it. So they're not going to save money, and there's no use in you trying. This was a report to the President of the United States in 1918 in trying to help and correct the miners' situation. What I've done up to this moment, as I said in the beginning, is to try and give you a genesis of which I have not seen in your reports and the psychologists and the other ivory towered group, of which I'm not one, so I can speak loudly. Then came another change, which was fundamental, but brought about by necessity. And that was health. This period that I have just talked about, the curse of the camp was the spring thaw and typhoid fever. Usually, anywhere from 40 to 60% of the camp went out with typhoid fever. Either went out in death, or as they used to call it, walking typhoid, which meant that the man wasn't sick enough to go to bed or too damned mean to go to bed, but he wasn't well enough to do anything else. And he was off. He occupied a house. They couldn't evict him. he was still employed, although there were no laws to say so. And he was a burden. Medicine at that time was not economically profitable in the true sense of the word as it is today, or maybe I'm wrong. It's questionable. So there were many doctors who had their degrees. This was prior to Rockefeller's Flexner, Abram Flexner.
1910.
Huh?
1910.
Yeah, this is prior to Flexner's looking over and talking about what a medical school should be. These men had diplomas. I wouldn't say they were diploma mill graduates. That would not be fair. They were sincere. They wanted to learn something of medicine, if nothing more than taking pulse and giving a prescription of some kind and living a little better than their neighbor. I'll cite you a little instance back from my father's time, if I may. I think most of us are always interested in some of the human things that happen. When Dad came to Elkins, unknowing to himself, he brought the fever thermometer. It didn't occur to him that everybody wouldn't have a fever thermometer. He was a Bellevue graduate, and in New York City the doctors had a fever thermometer. He quickly learned that he couldn't trust the oral taking of temperature. He just sat there, as he always said, ready to grab that thermometer before the teeth did. So he went to axillary temperature. He was called out in the country to see an elderly lady, supposed to be desperately ill. He went in and examined her. Got up and left the room, invited the family out to tell them what he found, and he'd no more than gotten out the door of her bedroom, and she started to scream. Dad said he turned around quickly, and here was this poor soul screaming and tears coming down, torrents. She was really beside herself. And he wondered what he had done. When he left her seconds before, she was all right. He went back to the bedside. And he finally got her calmed down enough to ask her, "What did I do? What happened?" "Oh," she said, "I'm going to die. You're going to tell the family I'm going to die." He said, "No, I'm not. You're going to get well. You're going to be all right. Don't get upset. Don't worry." "Yes, but you didn't use that machine on me, and if you didn't do it, you knew I was going to die." That was the thermometer. I might say that Dad used to say that no man could be a doctor unless he was also a psychiatrist. That was the days before we used the word psychiatry as we use it today. One of the first things he did was to find that in taking care of the patients, who were mostly miners, of course, or lumber people. The lumber people were usually Americans. They went into the woods. The foreigners went underground. Was to learn their language sufficiently to take a history. And consequently, he became very endeared to them. And I remember as a boy, I never could understand why, when they passed our house, lots of them would raise their hat. And I later learned it was in reverence because he thought of them and their plight. Now we jump for a moment, I will, not to tire you, and when you get tired, somebody raise your hand for either purpose. My father was a giant of a student. I was no match for him. In fact, I didn't belong to the same family. I think the greatest compliment he ever had, at least he felt so. And if your mind will go back a moment to what I'm going to say, you'll appreciate it. He spoke before a medical group in Baltimore, and William Osler introduced him. And his introduction was, I'm introducing to you the only man I know that can go from the bedside of a typhoid to the operating table of acute appendicitis and do justice to both. I'd like for that kind of a compliment to be made of me someday. He died in 1929. Most of you know little about that period. That was the post-war period in which each day millions were made and paupers were made. But a little like the miner, nobody ever saw the dollar. It was all on paper. He died on October 14th, 1929. Black Friday was October the 29th, 1929. So I had about 10 to 12 days of normal life. The only normal life I guess I've had in all of my medical practice, which was 50 years last June. Now what I'm taking is nitroglycerin, but it's not for coronary. I'm not going to do what Mr. Hoover just did. Don't excite it. I have an abnormality here that does an angina every now and then. Finally, somebody suggested that I use this, and it works part of the time. The day my father died, the road between Baltimore and Elkins was open to allow my sister and her husband, who is an associate professor of medicine at Hopkins and the recent author of a book on internal medicine. Some of you may know him, Dr. Paulson. To come through on hard-surfaced roads. Elkins became 5 hours and a half from Baltimore, the great medical center. Anytime you wanted to go, instead of twice a day, 12 hours. So I was faced with a dilemma. Did I stay or did I go back? And through some error of memory, I was still acceptable in Philadelphia. And I decided to stay. But to stay meant a complete change in the attitude. Medicine may be traced from the Greeks down in periods, but I think modern medicine can be traced to Belleau Woods, to the trenches of France and Germany, to the use of the needle instead of the rectal tube for feeding, a transformation, if you will, the knowledge of Ringer solution, the value of saline to the human body, all came about almost instantly with the armistice. And strides of medicine as a science and not as an empirical design on the human body had to be dealt with. The future was written. We had radium had come in. We were seeing the destruction of the immature cell by radiation. The Coolidge tube had come in, which meant that you weren't going to get killed when you measured the spark gap of the old static machine and took 5 minutes to x-ray a hand. The film had come in, so we didn't have to worry with glass plates. We began to do a little more than a urinalysis and a blood count, which was extremely limited to white and red cells, and a piece of paper for hemoglobin, which you matched. So faced with this, and the quandary, what do I do now? Stay here among my people, where I'm having a good time practicing medicine, or go fight red and green lights and hospital politics? I say that kindly, but I happen to know something about it, because while I was still a resident, the board sent me to New York to study hospitalization in lying-in hospital, Sinai Hospital, and hip joint disease. And then it was my pleasure to work with John G. Clark, Frank Hammond, Pollock, and others. When radium first came to America, I brought the first radium to West Virginia. So I began to see a little scientific medicine. And I was getting a little too old to pitch baseball anymore. And the contract I had from the Pittsburgh Pirates had run out. So I better settle down. Now, how do I settle down? What do I do? Well, we had 10 or 12 doctors in Elkins. We had this hospital, and then we had another hospital. Of course, a hospital in those days was a building on which there was a sign, hospital. And that was all that was necessary. Accreditation was coming in 20s, but it was having a hard time, and it didn't know what it wanted. The AHA was just being formulated, and the AMA didn't want that, and Morris Fishbein was beginning to crow. You all don't know who he was. That's a shame. He didn't listen. So I decided that I wasn't a student. I knew I wasn't. In my freshman or sophomore vacation, the last I had, from that day on I have spent in a hospital entirely. I took care of the great Horatio Wood. Now, unless you're a historian, you don't know who he was. But he's the father of the United States Pharmacopoeia. The finding of atropine and its opposite, some of the other drugs. He was more or less bedridden. And he was out in a little suburban community outside of Philadelphia. And on this hot July day, the screen door didn't fit very well, and I took it off and was sawing. He rang his bell, and I went in, and he said, "Got a carpenter here?" I said, "No." "Why?" He said, "Who's sawing that door?" I said, "I am." "Good, good. You better be a surgeon. You don't have brains to be an internist." So I had it mapped out for me. And there I was, just on the brink of the heyday of finances in this United States, and the catastrophe and the downpour. I sought from the local physicians to try and get them together and see if we couldn't divide our labors into a little more specific types. God forbid I didn't want them to be specialists, and I didn't want to be a specialist. Not sure I still want to be. But they weren't interested. My father had that problem, so I knew that if he couldn't do it, I couldn't do it. He was better at that than I was. So I sought a young man, local boy, who finished his medicine. He was interested in medicine. He came with me. We didn't know where the dollars were coming from. By that time, we had October 29th. More doctors were running streetcars than they were writing prescriptions. And we started to form a little group. I'd been to the Mayos. I'd been dazzled. I'd heard how they treat acute appendicitis, which they average 6 a year, but they could write papers on them. How they remove kidneys with x-rays. Even a Brownie camera could do better. Still, we had to take our hat off to them. They were doing something. They were paving a way. They were pioneers. And like all pioneers, they could be criticized, but also they could be respected. So I tried to see if I could get a few doctors who might be interested in having the fun of practicing medicine. All you did was come to the hospital in the morning, you had a little office, you put on an operating suit because we didn't know what air conditioning was, but you were comfortable. You took it off at 5 o'clock or 6 whenever you were through. You went home. But you could study. You could have a lot of fun. You might steal a dog off the street once in a while if you were so interested. See whether your sutures were too tight or too loose. Whether you could bring them back from ether. And don't ever try to give ether to a cat or you won't bring it back. And then we began to have patients. The patients came in from everywhere. But they didn't know whether they had a hole in their pocket or not because they had nothing to put in their pocket. But we were trying to hold on to a payroll. Back in 1922, 23, the checkoff came to northern West Virginia. It had been the southern end of the state. I said to you earlier, I think, that the company was glad to put in a doctor to get the men back to work. They also were glad because by that time there was a compensation law in the state. If a man got hurt, they had to pay. He got hurt on the job. Of course, you had to figure out where the job was. Was the job 2 miles underground at 2 o'clock or at 2:05? Was he supposed to be at work or was he at lunch? Oddly enough, and this will interest you all who are doing traumatic surgery, whenever I got an injury on the 1st of February, I knew he was going to be crippled for 3 months. It didn't make a darn bit of difference what he had, because the contract came up on April 1st, and he was on pension, compensation, so he wasn't going back to work. We had a lot of fun with that. By 1936, we had a 12-man group, a group of specialists, well-trained men. I was proud of them. I've always been proud of the staff. We thought we were going somewhere. We were coming out of the Depression. Our checks were coming through sometime, maybe a month late. We were able, all through that, to never reduce the salaries of a hospital employee or be late, even though we mortgaged our homes to do it. We prided ourselves, and for that we got loyalty, believe me. In 1937, by the good fortune of having good legal advice I inherited from my father, we got together and decided to really form some type of a close-knit group practice. Still trying to find out what is group practice. And if any of you have a definition today, I'm sure the group practice will be glad to have it, because they don't know how to qualify the yardstick now for the future of medicine. We wrote up the articles of the practice, which meant that all participants in the group, MDs of course, and one dentist, would participate in all scientific problems. We all would draw the same salary. If there was a little more and we could raise the salary, we all got the raise. Nobody was different from anybody else. For the benefit, if there's a radiologist or pathologist in the group, if he will look at that date and time, he will find that he usually was just this side of the outhouse. He was no real person in the necessity of good medicine. It was just an adornment. I remember Toby Weinberg, recently died, pathologist at Sinai in Baltimore, saying to me, "Gosh, this is the first place I know of that's ever recognized a pathologist as being a doctor." We drew up these articles. We were very proud of them. We sent them to the AMA legal department for their blessing and suggestions. That was a mistake. Never done it since. They wrote back and said it was idealistic. We hoped it would work and wished us Godspeed. And that was the prayer of happiness I got from the AMA in helping us. Then the war broke out. I might go back to the CCC, the civilian camps, for a moment, which Roosevelt put in, and for which we had about 100,000 boys stretched out to our neighboring counties, and for which we did their service. This is an interesting thing. You'll like it. We had two hospitals in the town, the Davis Memorial, which was a memorial, non-taxable, owned by no one, didn't even have a board till 1936, didn't have any certificate from the state to have a hospital. Senator Davis, Senator Elkins didn't need those things. They're like some of our modern politicians. So that when the camps came and they were put in charge of the Army Medical Department, the first thing I knew was the city hospital, and I say this in deference, please, was merely a wooden building built of second-hand lumber in which the chief surgeon and owner, it was a proprietary thing, had made a statement at the County Medical Society some years earlier. The only thing you need to do with these check-off patients, and he had several hundred of them, primarily in lumber, put them to bed, give them some aspirin, clean sheet, and something to eat, and they'll get well. Don't worry about it. And that was our competition. But as soon as I learned this, I went to Washington to see the Surgeon General. You know, you have to be naive sometimes. They would be mistakes, but because you're naive and people look at you in Washington and say, how dumb can you be? They open the door. They did. Well, the upshot was, we were the non-profit hospital. Therefore, it was tax supported, and therefore, by law, they had to give me the patients. They had no out. Incidentally, I one time went up to this lawyer that I'm talking about. I used to have to go up to him about every other day. I never knew there were so many legal problems. And I said to him on this day, E.A., I come up here every day at noon when I get the mail. I carried the mail in those days, sometimes a bedpan. And I could upset it like any good nurse. And I'd like to have a book or something on just ordinary law, so I won't be bothering you. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. Finally, I said, damn it, did you hear what I said? He said, yes. Well, I said, answer me. He said, Ben, I'm trying to. I'm just trying to remember the name of that book Mrs. Bowers got yesterday, Home Remedies, so you don't need to call a doctor. That taught me a lesson. So by 38, we felt we had organized a group. I had been to Mayo Clinic. Fortunately, I knew some of the men there. Frank Cruzen, the father of modern physiotherapy, was there. We were like brothers, and others. I'd been to Wheeling, where the Wheeling Clinic was being set up by the late Dr. Fulton, who didn't have to worry too much about the dollar because his wife owned 51% of Wheeling Steel. The only thing my wife owned was the mortgage that I took her. And I'd been to other places. And I decided this was one time you paddle your own canoe. The only thing is that somebody builds a canoe. Somebody was building this kind of medicine. And the great Morris Fishbein was coming out and blossoming. The great kingmakers of the AMA were not going to see group practice or anything else come in and rob them of being secretary and treasurer. You know, Pendergrast There's the American College of Surgeons, the North American Society of Radiology, of which I'm a member, and 3 or 4 others. Pendergrass of Philadelphia. He's the fellow with the chest, yeah.
Yeah, we know. Well, Mr. Blood.
Had a little sense of humor, if you knew him. And he was elected president of one of them, I don't remember which. And his first presidential article, he came out and he said, I had hoped we could get all of these organizations together under one roof for better scientific advancement. But I find that if we do, we'll lose 3 or 4 presidents, 4 or 5 vice presidents, and a half a dozen secretary and treasurers, and I guess God don't want it to work that way. So it never has. The war broke out. They took 5 of our men immediately, and then my good and dear friend, John L. Lewis, put a stop to that. So that left us 7, with 200,000 troops coming in for training. And because of a typographical error, they thought my father was still alive, who had played an active part in World War I in the medical group, was responsible for the opening of Fort Meade. They put me in supervisory charge as a layman over the troops. Now, I hope none of you, unless you become President of the United States, ever have to sit and lay clothes in civvies and talk to a captain or a lieutenant, because it don't go well. But we fought that through. They built a station hospital for me across the street from the hospital. And the 7 of us, which later became 6, one of the boys got interested in the neck of a bottle. He wanted to see the bottom. We couldn't tolerate that. Until 46. And then it was decided by that board which I created that they wanted the hospital to themselves. Of course, they didn't need to underwrite the mortgage anymore. Banknotes. So we moved out. And we really went into the business of operating a hospital and a clinic. The first question asked by some of you will be, do you think a clinic should run a hospital? The answer is yes and no. At a meeting of the American College of Surgeons in Baltimore, I severely criticized the Accreditation Commission, who sent a notice, Dr. Joe Smith will be in your hospital on the 10th at 2 p.m. to review your hospital. Any damn fool can get the charts out and see that they're up to date, and if he can't approve that, you're never going to get anywhere. So that was accreditation. There was a pathologist by accident got employed over at Kaiser. He came in to see me one day and he said, you know, I never knew there were so many normal ovaries outside of a human body in all my life as I'm seeing now. Do you all have any pathology? At that meeting, I suggested that if we're going to have accreditation, let's have it based on something substantial. Don't notify the hospital when you're coming, first, and second, don't send somebody down who can't make a living some other way or wants to semi-retire or just enjoys travel to see the world. Let's have a good, substantial setup. And the first would be a pathological review board. George Cryle, late George Cryle, to whom I have a tremendous respect for, one of our real science in medicine, was on the platform, and I was about 3 feet away from him, and he had the morning paper in his hand. And when I came out with that, he came across the top of my head, and he said, "What in the hell do you want to do to this organization?" So my desire to see scientific, instigated bureaus put into action for calibration of medicine flunked at that moment. Since then, you have your tissue committee, of which I feel I had something to do with, even if it was only a slap over the head. 46, as I said, we went out and bought a hotel. We had the great sum of $40,000 in our treasure, and within 2 days we owed $295,000. I hope God lets me live long enough that I don't owe somebody. I carry a credit card, but I don't know why they let me have it. But we were on our way towards building a group. What constitutes a group? Now we'll change the subject from the preliminaries to what you all sitting here are interested in. I'll briefly describe up to a point, and then I'll stop, and I'll let you all try and make me the target. To me, there are 3 kinds of groups. One is the proprietary, owned by someone or some 2 or 3. Maybe owned honestly for the purpose of good medicine. Maybe owned so they can play golf on Wednesday and Saturday. Maybe owned because they just like the idea. And all connected on the staff are full-time employees. Unlike my 36 and 37 experience, when the men around me did not know that tomorrow morning I may give them a pink slip, and therefore they could not be loyal, or they weren't worth anything if they were loyal and couldn't see ahead in the future. So you have the proprietary clinic. They're good and bad. We'll go into that in a moment. Then you have a second group, in which the old established members are the heavy owners of the stock. The younger men come in and obtain stock, and therefore participation to a limited extent. But their stock is minor. The promises are great. After 3 years, you become a partner, and you look around and find there's no doctor here over 3 years. It may make for good medicine. It may make for indifferent medicine. Now, in all of this description, I'm talking about human beings. So let's don't talk about the idealist. We may have never another Hoover. I doubt it. They're only one of a kind. They crucified one. But the medicine is usually of a pretty high type, because these younger men are activated by the knowledge that they can become a part and parcel of the organization. But they're usually separated for X period of time in management, advancing of ideas related of development of departments, etc. So they are better off than the full-time in a proprietary group than they were if they weren't in that group. The third group is that one in which there is a financial involvement, where the individual comes in. He may have to put in a certain amount of monies to start with, or maybe from his earnings an investment is made. He has a basic income. He is told, and truthfully so, that that basic income is derived from the living costs of the community, from what experience has shown the department does, and then he becomes a participant in the profits. The profits being that money when all else is paid for and maintenance is obtained. Without meaning to quote, but I will, because, and what I'm going to quote is a successful such group. But the success was based on the tremendous reputation of the founders, and that's the PAC group, New York. And if I may be a little egotistical, I feel that I'm the father of that group because I interested George and had much to do with its development. There, it may have changed since George died last year, year before. But prior to that, don't take this too. Prior to that, a man was taken in for 3 years with a guaranteed income. During that 3 years, he had two things to do. One, develop a practice, and two, produce scientific papers. Any of you who ever knew George Pack knew that you were not doing your job unless you were also doing mentally or physically or both scientific research and giving to the world some reason for what you were doing. He was a voluminous writer and a good one, and I think the greatest cancer surgeon we've ever had. So you have the three types, basically, of group practice. Now let's look at a group that started out as a proprietary group. This is all right. At one time they had a manuscript writer, several full-time research librarians, an artist, and a full-time photographer. The brains and the believer in this institution died. His brother took over. Like brothers, they didn't get along too well. And his brother decided that these men should participate in the income. There were 27 in the group. They were across the street from a well-kept hospital reputable institution in the Middle West. Now they have an underground passage. They outgrew their surroundings, and they decided to build a new clinic building. I guess they got their inspiration from the Mayo Clinic. To build, and they were going to build a 7 or 12-story clinic building, meant that money's now coming in as the gravy above the actual costs would be cut, because they were all participants. They were all, in a sense, owners. They were all the proprietors. What happened? 12 of them left within a year. They started the building. I think it's 7 stories high. They completed 5 floors. Then they became non-profit. I don't know the mechanism of it now, but the other brother's dead. And this is what can happen when there's no cushion and no understanding. Your group must be made up of several types of men who are primarily not businessmen, although they hate to be told that, but they're not. And the clinic becomes, if it's properly used, their protectorate. And as a protectorate, it's got to cushion its finances so as to promise at the end of active service a good retirement, an equitable retirement. The chief of orthopedics, the founding of the Mayo Clinic, one of the great names in orthopedics, told me that when he reached retirement at the clinic, he and his wife had to move out of their home and take the apartment over the garage because there was no planning to protect them. That's not true today at the clinic. There is some protection. So that one of the first items in group practice is that, 1, there shall be scientific acumen for the care of the patient, and 2, that the individual is guarded so he's free. Now the second group, I don't have much to say about it because to me it's an unfair and somewhere should be outlawed. This business of telling the young man, come, give you $25,000 a year, and at the end of the 3rd year you become a partner and you get 2% and then 10% and then 20%. God help you if you stay here 6 years. I don't know what we'll give you. You won't stay that long. Nobody does. The third group is where there's a basic income and then a participation. I'm out of date on that, behind times, because I'm a little sick at heart. This permits the selfish interest of those who do have it. And it said we all have our price somewhere. so that we know we must take in $32,000 a year to meet our basic income. And above that, we will get X percentage of our income. The desire to charge a little more, to add a little more onto the department, not to pass the patient over to where it should be, so that a qualified man and not a partially qualified man will be taking care of the patient. In other words, the patient becomes a means to the end of human instincts. Unfortunately, that is the trend. I'm bitter against it. I'm sorry to see it. I believe if a man goes into medicine, he goes into it because of a humanitarian instinct within him and a scientific desire to do that for which he's best trained, and that all else will follow. What good is a $50,000 or $60,000 income when you give half of it back to the government? You're not working for yourself. You're working for the government. And out of it comes the great loss of medicine today, bedside medicine. The human being still knows how to laugh and still knows how to cry. He may go to a department store or a supermarket and push a carriage and gossip. He may talk about this, that, or the other, but he still cries at a funeral and he still has pain. And as a doctor, that, to me, is why you went into medicine and why you went into training. And I do not believe that the future of medicine will survive when participation of income becomes a personal thing manipulated personally under the stress of private lives. Any more than sometimes I think it would be better if a doctor called up and said, I won't be in today. They won't let a man take over a 707 if he's had a quarrel with his wife or he doesn't feel well, and he's only got 100 people to worry about, or 200, for an hour or two. But you can hurt beyond all reason by a lack of courtesy, by a lack of understanding, by a lack of what my father did, learning the language so the patient felt he was interested. So that I believe that type of group practice, whether it be in General Motors, where if you turn out so many units and have to send back 50 of them because they're poorly constructed, or whether it's given medication and thought, I feel that there's a condemnation to the money involvement in the practice of medicine. The group practice is the way that medicine must be practiced. If you want to research, there is plenty of money for that. In fact, this is too much. We got a medical school up here now that's more interested in research than in MDs, and I'll tell them so. If they'll ask me. They won't. We're going to put up another medical school. I talked to the chief of the service in Washington, Georgetown, a year ago. Spent 8 years in research at NIH. Brilliant man. And he was just on his way to Yale. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I'm going up there. I've got a professorship. I said, I thought you were happy. You just organized your department here. You told me you can get all the money you need from the government as long as you do research. What's the matter? He said, you know, in doing all of that, I forgot the patient. Somehow or another, I like to deal with patients. And I'm going up to Yale, and we're going to do with patients. They can have this department here. They'll get all the money they need for research. Sure, research had its place. So is the test tube. But who wants to be a test tube? Who wants to be sick and have a doctor come in and sit on the foot of the bed, whether it's on your toes or not, it's immaterial, and half the time they make the bed, you know, so the sheet is so tight across the toes that we should have foot drops more than we do. We're just lucky. And he goes into the whole problem of a foreign language for 5 minutes, telling you this, that, or the other, and leaves you bewildered. A few years ago, a man walked into my office, introduced himself, said, I'm from Philadelphia. And I said, did you take sick here? He said, no, I came down to see you. Well, I said, thanks for the compliment. What have I done now? You never know when a revenue man's coming in. You know whether you got a still or you didn't pay your taxes. He said, I'll tell you why. He said, I'm very wealthy. I've got more money and I know what to do with. And I think I'm sick. I don't know. He reached in his pocket and he took out a number 10 envelope. It was thick, so big. He said, I have spent thousands of dollars trying to find out whether I'm sick or well. Now, through a friend, I learned about you. I don't care what you charge me, but for God's sake, don't hand me myself back in an envelope. Now, this is significant of where groups can go if there's not a checkmate, if there's not an understanding, and if there's not a decision early in the minds of the participant whether or not he likes, not the group alone, but whether he likes that type of medicine, number one. Number two, he likes the group he's in. And number three, can he mold himself, whether he likes it or not, into organization? None of us like to be in the Army. But by God, unless you know how to handle an M1 behind a dirt hill, you won't need to know anything about discipline or restrictions. And that's the story of medicine. That's as far as I'm going to bring you today in my... God, I did talk. May I apologize for talking so much. If I can answer any questions, be glad to try. The answers, I don't know them all. I just got fired because I didn't. Some of you know that.
Few of us know that. I'm going to ask you a few questions after Golden, if I may.
All right? Try and answer.
How do you think doctors should be paid in a group? I think
How?
you told us how they shouldn't be paid. I don't know if you really spelled out in your experience among that how they should be paid. I can tell you the basically doctors in this group are paid on the basis of their training and experience, a salary, with a bonus feature, based on an overall evaluation of, extra effort, extra call, extra duty. We have never at any time keyed income directly to productivity. We don't have shares or stock. This is a non-profit operation in that sense. There's profit sharing in the bonus mechanism. I suppose that there's as many ways to do this as there are groups. I'd never heard of two groups that did it exactly the same. I was curious, however, about the way you started. Because when you started, everybody was paid the same.
Up until 2 years ago, we were.
Up until 2 years ago?
Yes.
I'm absolutely astonished. What motivated you to change that?
I didn't. They did.
And what motivated them? And what did you do about two questions? One, a group of any size, people are going to be different. Not only different in the amount of cash they produce, but different in the amount of effort they expend in the practice of medicine. Unless you had the millennium and everybody was working exactly the same, which I find almost incredible. And secondly, what did you do about the fact that the market in medicine is so irrational and chaotic? You made a crack about pathologists and radiologists as being next to the outhouse. They also happen to be the richest people in medicine today. And they might enjoy their position next to the outhouse from the financial standpoint.
He meant they were 30 years ago.
I realize that. They're not there now. They've upgraded themselves considerably along with their
Yes.
equipment.
Practically closed the hospitals in New Haven, Toledo.
I once wrote a paper in which years and years ago, which you may have seen, on this subject. You try to calculate that the way we were paying people was designed to give them equal lifetime earning. And that is, a man is going to earn more, who trained more, but he started later. And a man who's paid less probably had less training, but he started earlier, all other things being equal. Which may be a way of saying you're paying everybody the same if you calculate their lifetime earning. I don't think there's any answer to this, except that some of the things you've told us, we have some negative answers that are probably injurious to the patient interests and to the cohesive life of the group to have departmental kitties, as it were.
I think
And
your
the
last
departmental kitty being the one from which you draw your remuneration. I know a lot of groups do this.
I think
a
your
lot of
last
them
statement sums it up. I cannot, neither can you, qualify a man. I cannot, neither can you, state what a man does by application of his time and duties. I know men that'll spend an hour and a half on a history and physical. Another man will spend 20 minutes. Give you an illustration of that. Tony Mandello was professor of surgery at New Haven, at Yale for a while. Tony could do a partial gastrectomy, anywhere from 45 to 65 minutes. Jim Gettings, a meticulous operator, never took less than an hour and a half, and usually 2 to 2.5 hours for the same type of surgery. That means that we start with an inherent qualification. It doesn't mean that one man's better than the other. But one man is more dexterous, we'll say. My father never was sure of his knots, and he always carried a string about so long. And when he was talking to you, he was always tying knots and then feeling to see if they were secure. Because he was not a good mechanic. Marvelous surgeon. Knew his anatomy par excellence. He could take out an appendix in 35 or 40 minutes, maybe an hour. I was told one time I did it in 12 minutes. I don't boast about it. So when we talk about that particular qualification, you immediately handicap, assuming both are sincere and serious, you handicap the slower man in his dividends of monies and create a problem. So that's one reason why I'm opposed. But if I take and go out and talk to the patients, 9 times out of 10, I'll find that the patient who's coming back to the clinic is the one who had an hour spent with him, not 20 minutes. So I have to say again that a guaranteeing of an equitable income beyond which is foolish, because we're paying it out in taxes. 90% of the men around here haven't the slightest idea of what in the dickens happens to their dollar. It's like the fellow who says, I make $20,000 a year. He doesn't. He's making 10. The rest of it he doesn't get. So that maybe in our peculiar profession, which is delimited not by piecework, but by application, humanitarian and scientific. We try to protect the less fortunate, not in ability, but in application of ability. I don't know the answer, but I know this, and I'll say it here and I'll say it to the clinic at home, that since we've gone into this profit-sharing business, and that's a word that I'm using, they don't like it. They've got some new words that the IRS gives them, because that don't go with the IRS. I don't think our medicine is good as it was. And I don't hear patients speaking with the admiration they did prior to this innovation. Now at PAC, they take a man who may not write a paper, but by virtue of his niche in some isolated scientific field is as important as if he wrote a book. He gets the sharing. 3 years ago, about 3 years ago, 4 maybe, I was with 3 of the men from the PAC group, including George. We were driving to a meeting. And of course, this discussion that you brought up came up. Now, in that packed group, nobody's starving, believe me. Their incomes are all in good figures, huh?
They're all surgeons.
Yeah, they're well fed. But one of them spoke up, and probably the fair-haired man before the thing is over. And he said, George, I wish we'd go to Ben's idea. I think there would be less griping and more happiness. Now, what do you do with the wayward man? If you have an executive committee that's got the guts to function, and I say that with all the stress I can, because without a good executive committee that has no feelings for personalities, your group is not good. You can't. My chief in gynecology lost 3 patients 1 month, all hysterectomies. Nowhere could we find the cause. And he got up in staff meeting and he said, I'll take over my 3 cases of this necropsy report. I have no excuse. I don't know what happened, but I know this, that if it isn't corrected, I will have a garage pretty soon. You all can come and have your cars repaired. That takes honesty and guts. But I believe if our medical schools were a little more honest in their teachings, when this same Alonzo Taylor spoke before the class of 1921-20, the University of Pennsylvania, he said, you're here in 3 groups. One, because your mother wants to have a doctor in the family. 2, because you think it's an easy life. You raise a yellow flag and you're a big shot in the community. Nobody can come near. You're a god. 3, about 30% of you are interested in the science of medicine, and that's the 30% I'm going to give a degree to. And he did. And I think our medical schools have become inoculated with this ungodly drive for financial status. And it's hitting medicine, and medicine's being hit by the public. I listened to a seminar the other day on television. Here is the cost of medicine. Here's a woman who takes her child in to a Pittsburgh hospital to have 1 tooth extracted. And the child's in overnight, and it costs $450.
Any other questions?
Now then, let's look at the answers. The president of the Allegheny County Society was there, and others. What is the asinine answers to this? When there are some sensible answers. Pittsburgh has had 2 strikes in the past year in their police force and in their fire department. The policeman isn't arresting somebody every 5 minutes. And the fire department, I'm sure the firemen sit at least 60% of the time playing checkers. But let the public of Pittsburgh, and the mayor tried it, cut the fire department and the police department by 30 or 40% and see what the taxpayers do. But the hospital must be 100% ready for the fire or riot, and nobody ever tells the public that. And when the man's brought in off the street, bleeding, there's got to be somebody in that emergency room. And he could have been there all day, and this is the only case brought in. But the public is not appraised of this. All they hear is $450 for taking out a tooth. Now, nobody asked that woman, first, why did they put the child in the hospital overnight to take the tooth out? And here's 200 or 300 people. It's a 12 o'clock thing on TV. None of these things are brought out. And none of these things are brought out to the student. I remember walking down the halls with Wayne Babcock, a surgeon some of you heard about. He had a little reputation. I had some other things for him. And we would see 30, 40, and 50 patients in our rounds. Where were 90% of them? In the charity ward. What were we doing in the evening, sitting around talking about our future in medicine? My God, look what Wayne Babcock's got. 50 patients in here. Hell, 90% of them didn't pay him a nickel. And when I got an offer to stay in Philadelphia, I found that 7 out of the working hours were going to be given to free clinics. And it wasn't as big then as it was when I was a student. I have no answer as to how to solve the whole financial problem. But I do think that every group should lay it on the table, out in the open, where everything can be seen. This, I think, is one of the mistakes. And if everything is seen, if I know, for instance, that when I am 70 or 65, I don't have to now save sending Mary and Joe to college. I can spend it because I'm going to have an income, not like the orthopod males. I'm protected, and maybe even my widow will be protected. And if that kind of understanding of the finances of life are given to the average young doctor, and maybe a little personal touch of the 60 patients Babcock had in the hospital that didn't pay, but did help his reputation. There was no question about that. He never charged a policeman in his life because he knew that everybody on that policeman's beat knew that Wayne Babcock did a damn good gallbladder operation. He didn't have to worry about it. So I do think you have an inequality of human application which has nothing to do with resources or ability, but it does have to do with an understanding. And if it's laid open, and a year or 2 years is given to a man to solve it, and an executive committee has got the guts to say, yes, you're a good guy, but you just don't apply yourself. When that 4 o'clock comes, you pull the shirt sleeves out of your gown in order to get to the door, to go home.
Can I ask a different question, Dr.
Yes.
Golden? Did the clinic at Elkins have pretty smooth running? You described as growth. You didn't have hospital problems in the sense that you later founded a hospital with which you affiliated, but did you have any medical society run-ins because of the innovative things you did?
Oh, yes.
What were the nature of those?
We were just as popular as the rear end of a skunk going west. We started in the heyday of solo practice. We had a doctor in town who wanted more science. He really was a good practitioner. And Banton and whatever his name came out with insulin, and Joslin formed the clinic. He went up to Harvard, spent a few months, and came back with the use of insulin. He was pretty well liked before that in the community. But when Dad and others said, question of diabetes, you better go see Dr. X. We've got a new drug. And he's been to Harvard and knows how to use it. I don't. This fellow became unpopular. So unpopular, in fact, he, at the age of 55, I guess, went to another town to practice. As far as we were concerned, I think I hold the record. I've been investigated for dismissal by the West Virginia State Medical Association, by the American College of Surgeons, by the American Medical Association. And if there's been others, I haven't been told. It's been secret with who. Now, I didn't answer your question, and I don't know the answer. But I do believe unless these younger men step over the line a little bit, Uncle Sam is going to tell them how they're going to draw their salaries. You know, when we dedicated our new hospital, Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare,
Gardner.
Common Cause, huh?
Gardner.
Gardner was our speaker and gave the first public utterance to the future of medicine in America is group practice. Now, there comes a time, you know, when you're told your car should have this done or the other, but you go out in the morning and it's zero weather and the damn thing don't start, and you say, I should have listened. And that's what's going to happen to medicine. Look what's happened. Just look. Go up to Temple and look at that tremendous medical office building inside the hospital. Go over Pennsylvania University and see the new Izzy Rabin Clinic building. Look what's happening in Clarksburg. As a trial run, 2 hospitals joining, being done other places. I heard before I got fired an applicant in radiology. And they were asking about all these things a radiologist now can't do. He can't work but so many hours a day to get exposure and all of that. And damn it, everything is so proof anymore that an ion could no more get out of a tube or ozone be generated in the cables. We that had the open tube and carried radium in our hands. We knew better, but we didn't have time. We're the ones that should have had the 8-hour day. And he said, this is all beginning to be a joke. Now it's the job. And we're beginning now to fill up that hunger gap. And some of these things are automatically going to change. And the place to have them change is within, not from without.
I'd like to make a statement about the Golden Room. I guess I'm known probably longer than anybody in this room for maybe 21 years now, and had the good pleasure of working with him through the area medical office. And I thoroughly, I've heard you speak many times, enjoyed your presentation very much. And I think in your retirement, Dr. Golden, I don't think you should even think in those terms, but I think your contribution to what you can give to us and others from your experience may be more widespread, more beneficial than maybe just sitting down in the Golden Clinic in Elkins. And I'd like to see you do more of this. And I appreciate it.
Thank you. May I? None of you ever had the privilege of knowing Fred Albee, the father of bone graft. Fred was a great little guy, lovable as they make them, till the New York Academy sued him for having his picture on the Orange Special in Miami, which he didn't even know existed when he bought the hotel down there for his arthritis winter. He sued him for $1 million and won. They still owed him $1 million when he died. He didn't collect it, but he just let him sweat. And I said to him one day, I said, Fred, you have been through all of this. Why don't you sit down now and spend some time giving us younger men some of the philosophy of medicine? He said, I'll tell you why, Ben. I didn't used to have a temper. Now I have. I'm afraid to try and put it on paper. Bill Laird. You all heard of the Laird Clinic. I have never met a more literary man than Bill Laird. You met him. Extremely well read. Extremely well read. He never wrote a letter, but he didn't emphasize it with a quote from somewhere. He wrote a little pamphlet, thing, that discussed on the residents being on time, sitting on beds and all of that. He said that was the biggest damn mistake I ever made in my life. The only person that got any benefit out of it was me. I got it off my spleen. I should have buried it before I published it. And that happens to be the truth with a lot of this. I mean, I get a lot of kick, maybe. You know, when you get old, you look back. I sit now, because I only have a 10% vision, and I watch the ball games. I couldn't watch them in black and white, but I can in color. See a man come up to bat, and they walk him. intentional walk. I think that ought to be called a siesta, because it's not sportsmanship. It's a failure of the pitcher to be willing to meet the ability of the batter. Has no place in sports. Should be out. Here, within the past couple of weeks, one of our men's wives has the misfortune to have a total malignancy of the abdomen following ovarian etiology. She had a vaginal hysterectomy. All my life I've been a little old-fashioned about surgery. If I couldn't help, I didn't do. I used to enjoy secretly, maybe naughty, when they'd come back and say, I had my appendix out, you know, since I saw you last, but I still got the pain. I suppose in my career, I did maybe a half a dozen vaginal hysterectomies, because I felt that a vaginal hysterectomy was about as unfair a procedure as could be done. First, any patient that undergoes a surgical procedure has a right to all the information that can be obtained while that procedure is going on. I one time had a patient who had a colon malignancy. I inherited it from my father. The neighbors inherited her from God knows where. The less I could do with her, the better off I was. So when I found this malignancy, which was almost total, I sent her up to Hopkins to dead now, the surgeon, chief surgeon at Hopkins, who was nice to me. Because I knew a colostomy had to be done. He called me up about 5 o'clock one evening. He said, what time are you going to be in Baltimore in the morning? I said, I'm not coming to Baltimore in the morning. Why? Well, he said, I've set this patient of yours up for 8 o'clock in the morning, but by God, you'll be here because there's going to be no surgery unless you're here. Do you know her? I said, yes. Why? He said, let me close the door. I think they can hear her from the 5th floor down. She don't want a colostomy. So I got into Baltimore at 6 o'clock in the morning, went up to the room and was met by the blast. But before I went up, Dean, what was his name? Dean Lewis. I dropped into Dean Lewis's office. I said, what's on your mind? He said, well, you know, we've got to do a colostomy on this woman. I said, yes, that's why I sent her up here. He said, I know it, damn you. I said, well, why the discussion? He said, Ben, I feel that every patient has a right to know what can be obtained in surgery. But they also have a right to make up their decision as to whether they want it or not, and the risks they want to take. Well, I went up. She went home that afternoon. And she lived for 8 more years. So that when this doctor's wife clinic is now taking alkylating drugs for what they're worth. Maybe they're good. Hope so. But had a abdominal exploratory been done, they may have found some abnormality about that ovary and removed it. Instead, they did a vaginal, which gave them no information, except a little bit, a few inches they could see. In talking to him the other day, he said, you know, I never could understand why you never did vaginal hysterectomies. And then he told me what I don't know now, didn't know, that the cycle is completely reversed. Now vaginal hysterectomies are out. They're not popular anymore. They're doing abdominal. And these are the things that you see. Some years ago, I was invited to quite a birthday dinner in Pittsburgh. Outstanding physician there. And among the guests was the editor of one of the pharmaceutical houses' new book, compendium they put out every week or month. He said, have you read it? I said, no. Have you seen it? I said, I think maybe it's been on my desk, but I read over 1,000 pages a month. I underline important articles, and the doctors find them on their desk in the morning when they come to work. And I expect to ask them how they like the article 2 days later, which I did all my life. I said, you don't need any new articles. Take and write a booklet reviewing what has lasted 10 years in the practice of medicine, is now still in use, that created a furor 10 years ago. He said, hell, I wouldn't have a job.
Small book.
Huh?
It would be a small book. We're getting late.
I'd like to make one more statement to attest to Dr. Golden's surgical I can say this again through our monitoring of the area medical office. The Golden Clinic Memorial
A
Hospital.
little louder, please.
The Golden Clinic Memorial Hospital has the lowest surgical rate through all the Morgantown area out of 30-some hospitals, with your average per patient was about 14% surgery, where most other hospitals in the area were averaging 30% or excess. And I'm sure that we know for 20 years.
That's right. That's right. That's right. You know, one year when the accreditation commissioner came in to see me, he said, I've got a question to ask you. I said, I don't understand this. 80% of your deliveries were cesarean this year. I said, yes. What's wrong about that? Well, he said, my God, that's high. I said, have you seen those patients? Do you know that some of them have had forceps on for 3 hours before I got them? Do you know I got them with temperatures 105 and 106? I don't have any antibiotics. I don't get the kind of patients you're talking about. They're $25 patients back home. And that was true. I early learned that every pain in the belly might be green apples and not appendicitis.
Yeah, well, Dr. Tallman, you're chairman of the conference. Are there any other questions that anyone here?
Golden.
We thank you again, Dr. Golden, for a great presentation.
Thank you, gentlemen.